Grace woke up with her heart pounding before her eyes were even open. It was still dark outside, but her body felt like something was wrong. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and saw it was only 5 in the morning, 3 hours before she was supposed to start getting ready for the biggest day of her life. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, trying to understand why her chest felt so tight. Today she was marrying Daniel Hart, the man she had loved for 6 years, the man her mother called her miracle, the man everyone said was perfect for her. So why did she feel like she was about to walk into a storm instead of a wedding? She sat up slowly and looked around the hotel room her best friend Charlotte had booked for her the night before the wedding, a tradition they had agreed on, so the bride and groom would not see each other until the ceremony. The wedding dress hung on the closet door, white and shimmering even in the dim light, waiting for her. She stared at it for a long moment, and instead of feeling excited, she felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. She shook her head, telling herself it was only nerves. Every bride felt this way, she thought. It was normal to feel scared before such a big step. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she reached for it quickly, hoping it was Daniel wishing her good morning like he always did. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. The message had no name attached, only a short line that read, "You should ask him about Lockswood before you say yes today." Grace stared at the screen, her fingers frozen. Lockswood was the name of a small seaside town where Daniel had grown up. A place he rarely talked about. A place he always changed the subject whenever she brought it up. She read the message 3 times, her heart beating faster with every second. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the number blocked itself, and the message disappeared from her screen, leaving no trace behind, as if it had never been sent at all. Grace sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She told herself it could be a prank, maybe an old rival from school, maybe someone jealous of her happiness. She had heard of such things before. Strangers sending cruel messages to brides just to create doubt on their special day. She decided not to let it ruin her morning. She placed the phone face down on the bed and walked into the bathroom to begin getting ready. But no matter how much she tried to push the message away, it stayed in the back of her mind like smoke that would not clear. By 7 in the morning, Charlotte arrived with a bright smile and 2 cups of coffee, ready to help her get dressed. Charlotte had been Grace's closest friend since university. The kind of friend who noticed even the smallest change in mood. As soon as she stepped into the room, her smile faded slightly, and she asked Grace if everything was all right. Grace forced a smile and said she was just nervous, the usual bride jitters everyone talked about. Charlotte did not look fully convinced, but she let it go, choosing instead to focus on helping Grace with her hair and makeup, filling the room with cheerful conversation about the ceremony, the flowers, and the guests who had already started arriving at the venue. While Charlotte worked on her hair, Grace's mother Margaret arrived with a small bag of jewelry that had belonged to Grace's grandmother, pieces meant to be worn on the wedding day for good luck. Margaret's eyes were shining with pride as she looked at her daughter in the mirror, but Grace could not fully enjoy the moment. Her mind kept drifting back to the message, to the name Lockswood, to the way Daniel's face always tightened whenever that town came up in conversation. She wanted to ask her mother if she knew anything about it, but she stopped herself, afraid of ruining the happy atmosphere in the room. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel was getting ready in a private room at his family's house, surrounded by his best man Oliver and a few close friends. Daniel looked calm on the outside, laughing at jokes and adjusting his tie in the mirror. But there was something in his eyes that Oliver noticed immediately. Oliver had known Daniel since childhood, long before Grace ever entered his life, and he could always tell when something was troubling his friend. As the other groomsmen stepped out to grab breakfast, Oliver quietly asked Daniel if everything was fine. Daniel hesitated for a moment, before nodding, and saying he was just anxious about becoming a husband. Oliver studied his face for a second longer, sensing there was more beneath the surface, but he chose not to push further, thinking it was simply wedding day nerves. As the morning went on, Daniel received a phone call that made his hand tighten around his phone the moment he saw the name on the screen. He stepped out of the room quickly, telling his friends he needed fresh air, and answered the call in the hallway, with his voice low and tense. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm but firm, telling him that she was already in the city, and that she needed to see him before the ceremony began. Daniel's jaw clenched as he listened, his eyes darting toward the door to make sure no one was near enough to hear. He told the voice that today was not the day for this conversation. that whatever needed to be said should have been said years ago. But the voice on the other end simply replied that some things could not stay buried forever. And then the call ended, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway with his heart pounding just as hard as Grace's had been earlier that morning. Back at the hotel, Grace finally slipped into her wedding dress, and for a moment, the beauty of the moment pushed away her worries. She looked at herself in the mirror, feeling like the woman she had always dreamed of becoming. And Charlotte clapped her hands together, with tears in her eyes, saying she looked like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly, whispering that her father would have been so proud to see her like this. For a brief moment, Grace allowed herself to feel only joy, letting the strange message and the mysterious town of Lockswood fade into the background of her mind. The car arrived to take them to the church, a beautiful old stone building on the edge of town that Grace had chosen because of its tall windows and the way morning light poured through the colored glass. As they drove through the streets, Grace watched the city pass by, trying to calm the fluttering in her stomach. She reminded herself of all the reasons she loved Daniel, the way he always remembered small details about her day, the way he supported her through the hardest moments of her life, the way he had asked her to marry him on a quiet evening by the river with trembling hands and nervous words. She held on to those memories tightly, using them as a shield against the doubt that kept creeping back into her thoughts. When they arrived at the church, guests were already gathering outside, dressed in their best clothes, chatting and laughing as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Grace stayed hidden inside the car for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping out. As she looked toward the entrance of the church, she noticed a woman standing slightly apart from the crowd, dressed in a long white gown that stood out sharply against the other guests wearing soft pastel colors. Grace's stomach twisted uncomfortably at the sight. She told herself it was probably a mistake. Perhaps the woman simply did not know the unspoken rule about not wearing white to someone else's wedding. But something about the way the woman stood, calm and unbothered, staring directly at the church doors, made Grace's unease deepen. Charlotte, who was helping Grace adjust her veil, followed her gaze and frowned slightly. She asked Grace if she knew the woman, but Grace shook her head, unable to look away. There was something familiar about her posture, something that tugged at a memory Grace could not quite place. Before she could think further, Margaret gently touched her arm, reminding her it was time to head to the bridal room, inside the church, to wait for the ceremony to begin. Grace nodded, forcing herself to look away from the woman in white, though the image stayed burned into her mind as she walked through the church doors. Inside the bridal room, Grace tried to steady her breathing while Charlotte fixed the final details of her dress. She could hear the soft sound of the organ beginning to play outside, signaling that guests were taking their seats. Margaret stepped out for a moment to check on the arrangements, leaving Grace and Charlotte alone in the quiet room. Charlotte held both of Grace's hands and looked into her eyes, telling her that no matter what nerves she was feeling, today was going to be the happiest day of her life. Grace wanted so badly to believe those words completely, but the unknown message and the woman in white sat heavily on her heart, refusing to be forgotten. A soft knock came at the door, and one of the church assistants peeked in to say that the groom had arrived and everything was ready to begin. Grace felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of excitement and lingering dread swirling inside her. She stood in front of the mirror, one final time, adjusting her veil with trembling fingers, and took a deep breath. She reminded herself that today she was marrying the man she loved, the man who had promised to stand by her forever, and whatever strange messages or mysterious visitors appeared today, she would not let them steal this moment from her. With that thought firmly in her mind, she turned toward the door, ready to walk toward her future, unaware of just how much that future was about to change in the next few hours. Outside in the hallway, unknown to Grace, Daniel stood near a side door of the church, his face pale as he spoke in hushed, urgent tones to the woman in white who had followed him there. Their voices were low, but the tension between them was impossible to miss for anyone who happened to walk by. Oliver, searching for Daniel to remind him it was almost time, turned the corner and stopped abruptly at the sight before him, his eyes widening as he quickly stepped back out of view, unsure of what he had just witnessed, but certain that whatever it was, it did not look like something that belonged on a wedding day at all. Oliver stood frozen near the corner of the hallway, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. Daniel, his closest friend since childhood, standing close to a strange woman in a white gown, speaking in low, urgent whispers just minutes before he was supposed to marry Grace. Oliver's first instinct was to walk away and pretend he had seen nothing, but something about the tension in Daniel's shoulders and the pleading look on the woman's face told him this was not a simple misunderstanding. He hesitated at the corner, unsure whether to interrupt or wait, his heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and worry for his friend. After a moment, Oliver decided to step back around the corner and pretend he was just arriving, hoping to catch a clearer sense of what was happening without alarming either of them. As he approached, Daniel noticed him immediately and straightened up, his expression shifting quickly from tension to a forced calm. The woman in white also turned, her eyes briefly meeting Oliver's before she looked away, her face unreadable. Daniel cleared his throat and told Oliver that everything was fine, that he was just talking to an old family friend who had come to wish him well before the ceremony. Oliver nodded slowly, though every instinct in his body told him this explanation felt incomplete. The woman, seeing the awkward tension building, offered a polite smile and said she would find her seat before the ceremony began. As she walked away, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor, Oliver watched her disappear around the corner before turning back to Daniel. He asked directly who she was, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and admitted only that her name was Laura, someone he had known a long time ago, back when he still lived in Lockswood. He insisted it was nothing important, just an unexpected surprise on an already overwhelming day. Oliver studied his friend's face carefully, sensing there was much more beneath those simple words. But the sound of the church bells signaling the ceremony was about to begin, left no room for further questions. Meanwhile, inside the church, guests continued to settle into their seats, the soft music from the organ filling the tall stone hall with a gentle, solemn beauty. Grace's father had passed away several years earlier, so her uncle Edward had agreed to walk her down the aisle in his place, standing proudly by the entrance in his best suit, waiting for the signal to begin. Margaret sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, overwhelmed with emotion at the thought of seeing her only daughter get married. The church was filled with friends and family from both sides, all chatting quietly, exchanging warm smiles, unaware of the storm quietly brewing behind the scenes. Charlotte, standing near the entrance of the bridal room, noticed the woman in white take her seat near the back of the church, slightly apart from the other guests. Her curiosity grew stronger, and she excused herself for a moment, telling Grace she needed to check something before the ceremony began. She walked quietly toward the back rows, trying to appear casual as she approached one of the ushers assigned to check guest names against the wedding list. She asked quietly whether the woman in the white dress was on the guest list, and the young usher, flipping through his papers, admitted that her name did not appear anywhere on the list, but she had told him at the door that she was a close friend of the groom and needed to be let in before the ceremony started. Charlotte's stomach tightened at this information, and she quickly made her way back toward the bridal room, deciding to speak with Grace about what she had discovered. But as she turned the corner, she saw Margaret already walking briskly in the same direction, with a worried expression on her face, having heard whispers among some of the guests about an unfamiliar woman, causing quiet murmurs of confusion. The two women exchanged a knowing look before stepping into the bridal room together, both aware that something needed to be addressed before Grace walked down the aisle, but neither wanting to be the one to shatter the fragile peace Grace had finally found that morning. Inside the room, Grace was standing by the window, watching the guests arrive through the colored glass, her bouquet resting gently in her hands. When Charlotte and Margaret entered together, their expressions immediately told her something was wrong. She turned to face them, her heart sinking, as she braced herself for whatever news they carried. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, before explaining gently that there was a woman outside, wearing a white dress, someone not on the guest list, who had claimed to be a close friend of Daniel's. Grace felt her chest tighten instantly, memories of the strange morning message flashing through her mind. She asked if they knew her name, and Charlotte admitted that the usher had not been given one, only that she insisted on being let inside. Margaret, trying to remain calm for her daughter's sake, suggested that perhaps it was simply an old friend Daniel had forgotten to add to the list, an innocent mistake that could easily be explained after the ceremony. Grace wanted desperately to believe this simple explanation, but the timing of everything felt too strange to ignore completely. The unknown message that morning had mentioned a place called Lockswood, and Daniel himself had grown up there before moving to the city for university. She wondered silently if this woman had any connection to that town, to that part of Daniel's past he rarely spoke about. Grace took a deep breath, reminding herself that today was still her wedding day, and she refused to let uncertainty rob her of the happiness she had worked so hard to build with Daniel over the years. She told Charlotte and Margaret that she would speak with Daniel about it after the ceremony, choosing not to let a stranger's presence disrupt this important moment. Charlotte squeezed her hand supportively, though her eyes still carried a flicker of worry, while Margaret nodded and stepped out to check if everything was ready to begin. As the final minutes approached, the wedding coordinator entered the room, announcing softly that it was time to line up for the procession. Grace's heart pounded as she took her place beside her Uncle Edward, who smiled warmly and told her how proud her father would have been to see her looking so beautiful. Grace forced a smile, trying to push aside her lingering doubts, as the heavy wooden doors of the church slowly opened, revealing the long aisle stretching ahead, lined with flowers and softly glowing candles, leading toward the altar, where Daniel stood waiting. The moment the music shifted into the familiar wedding march, every guest rose to their feet, turning to watch the bride make her entrance. Grace took her first step forward, gripping her uncle's arm tightly, her eyes scanning the crowd briefly, before settling on Daniel standing at the far end of the aisle. He looked handsome in his dark suit, his hands clasped nervously in front of him, but as their eyes met, Grace noticed something unusual in his expression, a flicker of tension beneath his practiced smile that made her chest tighten once again. As she walked slowly down the aisle, surrounded by the smiling faces of friends and family, Grace's eyes briefly drifted toward the back rows where she had first spotted the woman in white earlier that morning. To her relief, she did not see her immediately, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking perhaps the woman had already left or found a seat somewhere less noticeable. She continued walking, focusing her attention back on Daniel, trying to recapture the joy she had felt when she first put on her wedding dress that morning. But halfway down the aisle, a slight commotion near one of the side doors caught the attention of several guests, causing heads to turn and quiet whispers to spread through the crowd. Grace felt her uncle's arm tense slightly beside her, and she glanced toward the disturbance just in time to see the woman in white stepping quietly through the side door and taking a seat in the front row, directly across from where Margaret sat. The sight sent a cold wave of unease through Grace's entire body, but with the ceremony already underway, and every eye in the church now fixed on her, she had no choice but to continue walking forward, her mind spinning with questions she desperately needed answered. Grace finally reached the end of the aisle, her Uncle Edward gently placing her hand into Daniel's, before stepping back to take his seat beside Margaret. Daniel's hand felt slightly cold as it wrapped around hers, and Grace searched his eyes for the warmth and reassurance she was used to seeing, but instead found something guarded, something he seemed to be working hard to hide. She told herself it was simply nerves, the same nerves she had felt all morning, and tried to focus on the priest standing before them, ready to begin the ceremony that would join their lives together forever. The priest, an older man, with a gentle voice, who had known Daniel's family for many years, opened his prayer book and began speaking about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. His words filled the church with a peaceful rhythm, and for a few minutes, Grace allowed herself to sink into the moment, listening to the familiar words she had heard at countless other weddings throughout her life. She glanced sideways at Daniel, and for a brief second, he offered her a small, genuine smile that eased some of the tension in her chest. However, from the front row, Laura sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed intently on Daniel, unmoving throughout the priest's opening remarks. Margaret, seated only a few feet away, could not help but notice the way the woman's gaze never wavered, and it unsettled her deeply. She glanced at her daughter standing at the altar, silently praying that whatever this stranger's presence meant, it would not disturb the sacred moment unfolding before them. She reached for her handkerchief again, dabbing gently at the corner of her eyes, though this time her tears carried more worry than joy. As the priest continued with the traditional readings, Charlotte, seated among the bridesmaids near the front, kept glancing nervously between Grace and the mysterious woman in white. She noticed how Daniel's shoulders remained stiff throughout the ceremony, a sharp contrast to the relaxed, joyful groom she had expected to see on his wedding day. Something about the entire atmosphere felt off, as though the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Charlotte tried to shake the feeling away, telling herself she was simply overthinking things after the strange discovery she had made earlier that morning. The priest moved forward with the ceremony, inviting both families to share a moment of blessing over the couple. As Daniel's parents stood to offer their blessing, Grace noticed his mother's eyes briefly flicker toward the front row where Laura sat, a look of recognition crossing her face, before she quickly composed herself and returned her attention to the couple standing at the altar. Grace's heart skipped at this small but significant detail. If Daniel's own mother recognized this woman, then she was clearly not simply a stranger who had wandered into the wrong wedding by mistake. Grace's mind raced as she tried to piece together fragments of the morning's events: the anonymous message about Lockswood, the unexplained tension in Daniel's shoulders, the recognition in his mother's eyes, and the unwavering stare from the woman seated in the front row. She wanted desperately to pause the ceremony and ask Daniel directly what was happening, but the weight of tradition and the presence of every guest watching kept her rooted in place, forcing her to continue through motions that no longer felt as certain as they had that morning. The priest then asked the couple to face each other and prepare for the exchange of vows, a moment Grace had looked forward to for months, carefully writing and rewriting her words until they perfectly captured everything she felt for Daniel. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that this moment belonged to her and Daniel alone, regardless of who sat watching from the crowd. She looked into his eyes, searching for the man she had fallen in love with years ago, hoping to find reassurance that would silence the doubts swirling inside her. Daniel, sensing her gaze, offered a small nod, though his jaw remained tightly clenched beneath his calm exterior. He began his vows first, his voice steady at the beginning, speaking about the years they had shared together, the way she had supported him through difficult times, the dreams they had built side by side. Grace listened closely, feeling a warmth spread through her chest as his familiar words washed over her, momentarily silencing the unease that had followed her throughout the morning. But as Daniel continued speaking, his voice faltered slightly when he reached a line about promising to be honest with her for the rest of their lives. His pause was brief, barely noticeable to most of the guests, but Grace felt it immediately, a slight crack in his usual confidence that sent a fresh wave of worry through her body. She glanced quickly toward the front row again, and this time, she caught Laura's expression shifting slightly, a flicker of something that looked almost like sorrow crossing her face, before she lowered her eyes to her lap. Grace forced herself to remain composed, waiting for her turn to speak her own vows. When the priest nodded toward her, she took a deep breath and began, her voice trembling slightly at first, before steadying as she spoke about the love and trust she had built with Daniel over the years, about the future she had always imagined they would share together. As she spoke, she watched his face carefully, searching for any sign that would explain the strange tension building around them, but his expression remained carefully guarded, giving her nothing but polite attention. Just as Grace finished her vows, the priest turned to retrieve the rings from Oliver, who stepped forward with visible reluctance, his eyes briefly meeting Daniel's, with an unspoken question neither of them could address in that moment. As the priest held up the rings, preparing to bless them before the exchange, a soft murmur rippled through the crowd, and several guests turned their heads slightly toward the front row where Laura sat, her hands now clasped tightly together in her lap, her knuckles turning pale from the pressure. The priest, unaware of the growing tension in the room, continued the ceremony, blessing the rings with practiced words, before instructing Daniel to place the ring on Grace's finger. As Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers trembled slightly, and Grace felt a chill run through her at the unmistakable shake in his touch. She looked up at him questioningly, but he avoided her eyes, focusing instead on sliding the ring carefully onto her finger, his jaw tightening with every passing second. Once the ring was in place, the priest turned to Grace, instructing her to do the same for Daniel. She picked up his ring with steady hands, determined not to let her own nerves show, and slid it onto his finger while speaking the traditional words of commitment. As she finished, she glanced up at him one final time, hoping to see relief or joy reflected in his eyes, but instead found only a distant, troubled expression that made her stomach twist painfully. The priest smiled warmly at the couple, unaware of the silent storm building around them, and prepared to move into the final portion of the ceremony, the moment where he would traditionally ask if anyone present had any reason why the couple should not be joined in marriage. As he opened his mouth to speak the familiar words, the entire church fell into a heavy, expectant silence, and even the soft rustling of guests shifting in their seats seemed to pause entirely, as though everyone in the room sensed that something significant was about to unfold. The priest cleared his throat gently and looked out across the church, preparing to speak the traditional words that had been spoken at countless weddings before this one. He asked if anyone present had a reason why Daniel and Grace should not be joined together in marriage, and if so, to speak now or forever hold their peace. The question hung in the air for a brief moment, the usual silence expected to follow, before the priest moved on to the final blessing. But this time, the silence broke almost immediately. Laura rose slowly from her seat in the front row, her white dress catching the light streaming through the tall stained glass windows. Every head in the church turned toward her at once, gasps rippling through the crowd like a wave. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while Charlotte grabbed the arm of the bridesmaid beside her, her eyes wide with disbelief. Grace felt her entire body freeze at the altar, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it. Daniel's face turned pale the moment he saw Laura standing, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out, his throat tightening with the weight of everything he had tried so desperately to keep hidden. The priest, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events, looked between Daniel and Laura with visible confusion, unsure of how to proceed with a situation that rarely occurred outside of old stories and films. Laura's voice, though trembling slightly, carried clearly through the silent church. She said she was sorry for the disruption, but she could not sit quietly and watch Daniel make promises he had already made to someone else years before, promises he had never truly kept. Her words sent a fresh wave of shocked murmurs through the guests, and Grace felt the ground seem to tilt beneath her feet, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Grace turned to look at Daniel, searching his face desperately for some explanation, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding that could be quickly cleared away. But Daniel's silence, his refusal to meet her eyes, told her more than any words could have. Margaret rose from her seat, her voice shaking as she asked Laura directly what she meant by her claim, demanding to know what history existed between her and Daniel that had brought her to this church on such an important day. Laura took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small object Grace could not immediately identify. She explained, her voice growing steadier with each word, that she and Daniel had been together for 2 years back in Lockswood, long before he moved to the city and met Grace. She said they had even spoken of marriage themselves, exchanging promises under very different circumstances, before Daniel suddenly left without a proper explanation, cutting off all contact and building a new life, as though their shared history had never existed. The church erupted into a low buzz of whispered conversations, guests turning to each other in stunned confusion, trying to make sense of the unfolding drama. Grace stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet nearly slipping from her trembling fingers, her mind replaying every strange moment from the morning. The anonymous message, Daniel's tension, his mother's recognition of Laura's face. Every piece was beginning to fit together into a picture far more painful than she had ever imagined. The priest, attempting to regain some control over the ceremony, raised his hands and asked everyone to remain calm, suggesting that perhaps this conversation would be better held privately after the service concluded. But Grace, finding her voice for the first time since Laura had stood, shook her head firmly and said she needed answers now, not later, not after she had already said her vows and exchanged rings with a man who might have been hiding something as significant as an entire relationship from her. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out strained and unsteady. He admitted that he had known Laura in the past, that they had dated when he was younger, but he insisted it had ended long before he ever met Grace, and that whatever Laura believed still existed between them was simply a misunderstanding, born from unresolved feelings on her part alone. Laura's expression hardened at his words, and she stepped closer, holding up the small object in her hand, revealing it to be an old photograph, slightly worn at the edges, showing a much younger Daniel standing beside her on a beach, both of them smiling brightly, his arm wrapped affectionately around her shoulders. Grace stared at the photograph from where she stood, unable to look away from the image of Daniel looking so happy, so open, in a way she realized she had rarely seen in their own years together. Margaret moved closer to her daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, while Charlotte rushed forward from her seat, standing beside Grace in a show of quiet support. The guests remained frozen in their seats, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and secondhand embarrassment, unsure of what would happen next. Laura continued, her voice growing emotional as she explained that she had only recently discovered Daniel was getting married, and that despite her attempts to reach out privately and speak with him before the wedding, he had ignored her calls and messages until she had no choice but to come here herself. She admitted she had sent the anonymous message that morning, hoping Grace would ask Daniel directly and perhaps avoid this painful public confrontation altogether. But when nothing changed, she felt she had no other option left. Grace's eyes widened at this revelation, realizing that the mysterious message from earlier that morning had indeed come from Laura herself, a final desperate attempt to warn her before things reached this point. She turned to look at Daniel once more, her voice quiet but firm, as she asked him directly if everything Laura had said was true, if he truly had a hidden history with this woman that he had never once mentioned throughout their entire relationship together. Daniel's silence stretched on for several long, agonizing seconds, the entire church waiting with bated breath for his response. Finally, he lowered his eyes and admitted quietly that yes, he and Laura had been serious once, more serious than he had ever told Grace, but he insisted that those feelings belonged entirely to the past and had no bearing on the love he felt for Grace now. His confession, though quiet, landed with the force of a thunderclap throughout the silent church, confirming every fear that had been building inside Grace since the moment she woke up that morning. Grace stood at the altar in her white dress, feeling as though the entire world around her had gone completely silent, except for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Daniel's confession hung heavily in the air, and she realized that everyone in the church, every friend, every family member, every distant relative who had traveled from far away to witness this day, had just heard the man she was about to marry admit to hiding a serious relationship from her. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of embarrassment and rising anger, but beneath it all, a deep sadness settled into her chest like a stone. Margaret stepped forward slightly, placing herself protectively beside her daughter, her eyes fixed sharply on Daniel, with a look of profound disappointment. She had always considered Daniel a good man, someone worthy of her daughter's love, and this sudden revelation shattered the image she had carefully built of him over the years. She asked him directly, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion, why he had never mentioned any of this before allowing Grace to plan an entire wedding around promises built on hidden truths. Daniel struggled to find the right words, his hands running nervously through his hair as he tried to explain himself under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. He said that his relationship with Laura had ended painfully, and that he had convinced himself burying the memory completely was the healthiest way to move forward with his life. He insisted he never meant to deceive Grace, that he simply believed the past should remain in the past, separate from the future he wanted to build with her. Laura, still standing near the front row with the old photograph clutched tightly in her hand, shook her head slowly at his explanation. She said that burying the past did not erase the promises he had made to her, promises of a future together that he had abandoned without any real closure. She admitted that seeing him move forward so completely, planning an entire wedding as though their shared history meant nothing, had been more painful than she expected to bear silently from a distance. Grace listened to the exchange between Daniel and Laura, feeling increasingly like an outsider in a conversation that somehow involved her entire future. She turned to Daniel, her voice steadier than she expected given the storm raging inside her, and asked him plainly whether there was anything else he had kept hidden from her, any other truths buried beneath the surface of the life they had built together over the past 6 years. Her question hung in the air, demanding an answer he seemed reluctant to give. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flickering briefly toward Laura before returning to Grace. He admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that there had been moments over the past year when Laura had reached out to him, and that instead of telling Grace immediately, he had responded privately, telling himself he was simply offering closure to an old relationship. He insisted nothing improper had happened between them, but the very fact that he had kept these conversations secret sent a fresh wave of hurt through Grace's chest. The guests in the church remained utterly silent, watching the unfolding drama, with expressions ranging from shock to quiet sympathy, directed toward Grace. Charlotte stood close beside her friend, her hand resting supportively on Grace's arm, silently offering strength through the physical connection, since words felt entirely inadequate in that moment. Oliver, standing near Daniel as his best man, looked deeply troubled, clearly torn between loyalty to his oldest friend and sympathy for the woman standing at the altar in obvious distress. The priest, uncertain of how to proceed with a ceremony that had veered so far from its intended path, gently suggested once again that perhaps this conversation would be better continued away from the eyes of the gathered guests. Grace turned toward him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and nodded slowly, agreeing that some matters truly deserved privacy, but she made it clear that she needed the full truth before making any decisions about how the rest of this day, and the rest of her future, would unfold. Daniel's mother rose from her seat, her face pale with distress, and quietly confirmed to Grace that she had indeed recognized Laura earlier during the ceremony, having met her briefly many years ago when Daniel still lived in Lockswood. She admitted she had hoped the past would remain buried, believing it was Daniel's responsibility alone to share such details with his future wife, and she expressed deep regret for the pain this revelation was now causing on what should have been a joyous day for the entire family. Grace absorbed this information quietly, feeling the weight of it settle heavily over her heart. She realized that even members of Daniel's own family had known pieces of this hidden history, choosing silence over honesty, leaving her to build an entire future on a foundation she now understood was far less solid than she had believed. The realization brought a fresh wave of hurt, not just from Daniel's actions, but from the collective silence that had surrounded her for so long without her knowledge. Laura, seeing the pain clearly etched across Grace's face, stepped forward slightly, her expression softening with what appeared to be genuine remorse for the manner in which the truth had come to light. She said she never intended to hurt Grace personally, that her frustration had always been directed at Daniel's unwillingness to face their shared past honestly, and she apologized sincerely for choosing such a dramatic and public moment to finally confront him about everything that had remained unresolved between them for so long. Grace turned back to Daniel, studying his face carefully, searching for any remaining trace of the man she thought she had known so completely over the past 6 years. She asked him one final question, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent church, wanting to know if he still harbored any unresolved feelings for Laura, feelings that might explain the secret conversations and the tension she had sensed building all morning long, before any of this had come to light in front of their families and friends. Daniel stood frozen at the altar, Grace's question hanging heavily in the air between them. Every guest in the church leaned forward slightly, waiting to hear how he would respond to something that would determine the entire course of the day ahead. He opened his mouth several times, as though searching for the right words, but nothing came out clearly, his hesitation speaking volumes louder than any answer he could have offered. Grace watched him struggle, feeling her heart sink further with every passing second of silence. Finally, Daniel admitted quietly that he honestly did not know how to answer her question with complete certainty. He said that when Laura had reached out to him recently, old feelings he thought he had long buried had resurfaced unexpectedly, confusing him during a time when he should have been entirely focused on his upcoming marriage to Grace. He insisted this confusion never changed his commitment to marrying her, but the admission itself, spoken aloud in front of everyone, felt like a betrayal far greater than anything he could have said before this moment. Grace felt something inside her shift entirely at his words, the last remaining hope she had been clinging to finally giving way beneath the weight of his honesty. She had spent the entire morning trying to convince herself that whatever strange tension surrounded this day could be explained away, resolved quietly, forgiven and forgotten, so they could move forward into their marriage as planned. But hearing Daniel admit to genuine confusion about his feelings, on the very day he was meant to promise himself to her completely, changed everything she had believed about their relationship. Margaret placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in her eyes. She told Grace quietly that she did not need to make any decisions in this moment, out of pressure or embarrassment, that whatever choice she made, her family would stand beside her completely. Charlotte nodded in agreement, squeezing Grace's hand tightly, silently reinforcing the same message of unconditional support, regardless of what happened next. The church remained heavy with tension, guests whispering quietly among themselves, some already reaching for their phones to send messages to friends who had missed the ceremony, unable to believe the dramatic scene unfolding before their eyes. Oliver stood beside Daniel, his expression torn with conflicting loyalties, wanting desperately to support his oldest friend, while simultaneously feeling deep sympathy for the pain so visibly written across Grace's face. Laura, watching the exchange between Grace and Daniel, seemed to realize the full weight of what her actions had set into motion. She stepped back slightly, lowering the photograph she still held, her earlier determination softening into something closer to regret. She said quietly that she never wished to be the reason for destroying someone else's happiness, that her only goal had been honesty, believing Grace deserved to know the truth before making a lifelong commitment built on incomplete information. Grace turned to look directly at Laura, studying her face carefully for the first time since the confrontation began. She realized, somewhat surprisingly, that she felt no anger toward this woman standing before her, only a strange, hollow understanding. Laura had not created the deception that surrounded this day. She had simply refused to remain silent about it any longer. The true weight of dishonesty rested entirely with Daniel, the man who had chosen silence over truth for months, perhaps even years, allowing Grace to walk toward this altar without the full picture of the life she was agreeing to build with him. Grace turned back to Daniel, her voice steadier now, though tears had begun quietly falling down her cheeks, despite her efforts to remain composed. She told him that what hurt her most was not necessarily the existence of a past relationship. Everyone carried history before finding the person they chose to build a future with, but rather his decision to hide ongoing conversations with Laura from her, allowing her to continue planning their wedding without any knowledge of the uncertainty clouding his own heart. Daniel reached out toward her, his eyes filled with desperate regret, asking her to give him a chance to explain everything privately, away from the watching eyes of their families and friends. He insisted that despite his confusion, his love for Grace remained real and unwavering, and he begged her not to let this public revelation destroy everything they had built together over 6 meaningful years of partnership and shared dreams for their future. Grace looked down at their joined hands, the wedding rings they had exchanged only minutes earlier, now feeling strangely heavy on her finger. She thought about the years of trust she had placed in him, the sacrifices she had made for his career, the future she had imagined so vividly for the two of them. She realized that trust, once so deeply shaken on the very day, meant to celebrate its strength, could not simply be repaired through private conversation and quiet reassurance alone. The priest, sensing the gravity of the moment, gently asked if Grace wished to continue with the ceremony, or if she needed additional time to consider her decision, given everything that had just come to light. His question, though carefully worded, made the reality of the situation undeniably clear to everyone present. This was no longer simply a wedding ceremony proceeding as planned, but a genuine crossroads where Grace now held the power to decide the entire direction of her future, standing at the very altar where she had once believed her greatest happiness would begin. Grace stood silently for a long moment, the priest's question still hanging in the air, the entire church waiting anxiously for her response. She looked around slowly, taking in the faces of everyone who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She saw her mother's worried expression, Charlotte's supportive gaze, Oliver's conflicted eyes, and finally, Daniel's desperate face, still pleading silently for a chance to make things right between them. She thought back to the anonymous message she had received early that morning, the strange unease that had followed her throughout the day, the small cracks in Daniel's composure she had noticed, but chosen to ignore. She realized now that some part of her had sensed this moment coming long before it actually arrived, though she had refused to acknowledge it fully, choosing instead to trust in the years of love and partnership she believed they had built together. Grace turned to Daniel, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. She told him that she appreciated his honesty, difficult as it was to hear in front of everyone they knew, but that honesty coming this late, forced out only because Laura had refused to remain silent, was not the same as the honesty she deserved from a partner she was about to promise her entire life to. She said that trust, once broken so completely on the very day meant to celebrate its strength, could not simply be rebuilt through desperate promises made in a moment of public crisis. Daniel's face crumbled at her words, understanding beginning to dawn that this conversation was moving toward an outcome he had never imagined possible on his wedding day. He stepped closer, reaching for her hands again, his voice breaking as he begged her to reconsider, insisting that whatever mistakes he had made, his commitment to their future together remained genuine and unshaken. He reminded her of the years they had shared, the dreams they had built side by side, pleading with her not to let one difficult morning erase everything they had worked toward together. Grace felt tears streaming freely down her cheeks now, her carefully applied makeup smudging slightly, as she struggled to find the right words to express everything churning inside her. She told him that she still cared for him deeply, that the years they had shared together had been real and meaningful. But she could no longer ignore the doubt now planted firmly in her heart, doubt that would follow her throughout their marriage if she chose to continue forward despite everything that had just been revealed. Margaret stepped forward gently, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, reminding her softly that whatever decision she made in this moment would shape the rest of her life, and that she should trust her own instincts rather than the pressure of watching eyes or the fear of disappointing anyone gathered in the church that day. Charlotte nodded in agreement, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears as she watched her closest friend navigate the most difficult moment of her life. Laura, watching quietly from where she stood, spoke softly, saying that she never wished to force Grace into any particular decision, only to ensure she had the complete truth before committing to a lifetime with Daniel. She admitted that regardless of what Grace decided, she took no satisfaction in causing such pain on what should have been a beautiful day, and she offered a quiet, sincere apology for the disruption her presence had caused to the ceremony. Grace turned to look at the priest, who stood patiently waiting for her response, his expression kind and understanding, despite the unusual circumstances surrounding this particular ceremony. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church for everyone to hear. She said that she could not, in good conscience, continue with vows built on a foundation she now knew had been compromised by secrets and hidden conversations she had never been made aware of. The church fell into stunned silence at her words, though many guests seemed to have already anticipated this outcome, given everything that had unfolded over the past several minutes. Daniel's shoulders slumped in defeat, tears now falling freely down his own face, as the reality of losing Grace began to fully settle over him. He whispered her name softly, one final plea escaping his lips, but Grace shook her head gently, her decision now firmly settled despite the pain still radiating through every part of her body. She looked down at the wedding ring on her finger, the symbol of a commitment she had believed would last forever, now feeling like a heavy reminder of promises built on incomplete truths. She reached down slowly, her hands trembling slightly, and began to remove the ring from her finger, the metal cool against her skin as she held it carefully in her palm, preparing to make a final, decisive statement in front of everyone who had gathered to witness what they believed would be a joyful union. The entire church watched in complete silence as Grace held the ring in her open palm, understanding immediately the significance of the gesture she was about to make. Charlotte reached out to steady her friend's shoulder, offering silent support as Grace prepared to take the final step that would forever change the course of her future, choosing her own dignity and self-respect over a marriage she now understood could never truly provide the honesty and trust she deserved from a lifelong partner. Grace held the ring firmly in her palm, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her like nothing she had ever experienced before. The entire church remained silent, every guest watching intently as she took a slow, steadying breath, preparing herself for what she knew needed to happen next. Daniel stood before her, his eyes red from unshed tears, his expression a mixture of desperation and quiet resignation as he watched the woman he loved prepare to walk away from the life they had planned together. She looked up at him one final time, her voice steady, despite the tremor still present beneath the surface of her composure. She told him that she forgave him, not because his actions deserved immediate forgiveness, but because holding on to anger would only weigh her down as she moved forward into whatever came next for her life. She said that she hoped he would find peace with Laura, or with whatever path he chose moving forward, but that path could no longer include her standing beside him. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, his throat tightening with emotion as he realized nothing he could say now would change her decision. He reached out one final time, his fingers barely brushing against hers as she extended her hand, placing the ring gently into his open palm. The small metallic sound of the ring settling against his skin seemed to echo throughout the silent church, marking the definitive end of a chapter both of them had once believed would last a lifetime. Grace turned to face the gathered guests, her chin lifted with a quiet dignity that surprised even herself given the circumstances. She thanked everyone for traveling from near and far to celebrate what they had believed would be a joyous occasion, acknowledging the love and support so many people in that room had shown her throughout the years leading up to this day. She apologized for the disruption to their afternoon, though many guests immediately shook their heads, their expressions filled with sympathy rather than judgment toward the woman standing so bravely before them. Margaret stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter, whispering words of comfort and pride into her ear, telling her how proud she was to witness Grace choose herself over a compromised future, even in the face of such immense public pressure and personal heartbreak. Charlotte joined the embrace moments later, her own tears now falling freely as she held onto her closest friend, offering silent strength through their physical closeness in this incredibly difficult moment. Oliver, watching from beside Daniel, placed a hand gently on his old friend's shoulder, understanding the depth of pain and regret now settling over him. He said nothing, recognizing that no words could adequately address the consequences of choices Daniel had made long before this day. Choices that had ultimately led to this painful and very public conclusion, in front of everyone who mattered most to both of them. Laura, standing quietly near the front row, watched the scene unfold with an expression of complicated emotion, part relief at finally speaking her truth, part sorrow at witnessing the pain her honesty had caused for a woman she barely knew. She approached Grace slowly, her voice soft and sincere, as she once again apologized for the manner in which everything had unfolded, expressing genuine hope that Grace would find happiness and peace in whatever came next for her life, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together in such an unexpected way. Grace nodded at Laura's words, finding within herself a surprising measure of grace and understanding, despite everything that had happened. She told her quietly that she held no resentment toward her, recognizing that the true source of the pain she felt originated not from Laura's honesty, but from Daniel's prolonged silence and hidden conversations that had denied her the opportunity to make an informed decision about her own future from the very beginning. The priest, observing the quiet dignity with which Grace had handled such an unprecedented situation, offered a few gentle words about strength, self-respect, and the courage required to choose truth over comfortable illusion, even when that choice came at tremendous personal cost. His words seemed to resonate throughout the church, several guests nodding quietly in agreement, recognizing the remarkable composure Grace had displayed throughout an experience that would have broken many people completely. As the reality of the situation settled fully over everyone present, murmurs began to spread quietly through the crowd, guests turning to each other to process everything that had just unfolded before their eyes. Some spoke in hushed tones of sympathy for Grace, others expressed shock at Daniel's admission, while a few simply sat in stunned silence, unable to fully process how dramatically the ceremony had shifted from its intended joyful celebration into something far more complicated and emotionally charged than anyone could have anticipated when they first arrived that morning. Grace took one final look around the church, at the flowers she had chosen so carefully, at the candles still flickering gently along the aisle, at the faces of everyone who had come to support her on this day. She realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the pain still radiating through her chest, she felt an unexpected sense of clarity beginning to settle over her, a quiet understanding that walking away from this altar, though incredibly difficult, represented the first true step toward reclaiming her own future on her own terms. With her mother and Charlotte standing close beside her, Grace took a deep breath and began walking away from the altar, her white dress trailing softly behind her as she moved down the aisle in the opposite direction from which she had entered only a short while earlier. The guests remained seated, many watching with quiet respect, some rising slightly, as if unsure whether to offer comfort or simply allow her the space to leave with the dignity she had so clearly chosen to maintain throughout this painful ordeal. As she passed each row of familiar faces, Grace noticed small gestures of support, an encouraging nod from her aunt, a gentle hand reaching out briefly to touch her arm, quiet words of admiration whispered just loud enough for her to hear as she walked steadily toward the church doors. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to let her tears fall freely in front of the crowd, determined to leave this chapter of her life with the same grace and composure that had defined her throughout the entire difficult morning. Daniel remained standing at the altar, watching helplessly as the woman he loved walked away from their shared future, the ring she had returned still resting heavily in his open palm. Oliver stood beside him, offering quiet support, though no words could truly address the magnitude of what had just occurred. Daniel's parents sat frozen in their seats, their expressions a mixture of shame and sorrow, understanding fully now the consequences of secrets kept for far too long. secrets that had ultimately cost their son the life he had spent years building with Grace. Laura remained near the front of the church, watching Grace's departure with a complicated mixture of emotions swirling through her chest. She had come seeking closure and honesty, never intending to become the catalyst for such a dramatic and public conclusion to someone else's wedding. As Grace passed by her on the way out, their eyes met briefly, and though no words were exchanged between them, something like mutual understanding passed silently in that single fleeting glance. Outside the church, the afternoon sun felt almost too bright against Grace's face as she stepped through the heavy wooden doors, leaving behind the confusion and heartbreak that had unfolded within those ancient stone walls. Margaret and Charlotte followed closely behind her, both women wrapping supportive arms around her as they walked together toward the waiting car that had originally been arranged to carry the newly married couple away from their celebration. Grace paused for a moment at the top of the church steps, taking in a deep breath of fresh air, feeling the weight of the morning's events finally beginning to settle over her, now that she had physically removed herself from the tense atmosphere inside. She looked down at her hand, now empty of the ring that had symbolized promises she now understood had never been entirely honest from the very beginning, and felt a strange mixture of grief and relief washing over her simultaneously. Charlotte squeezed her hand gently, telling her softly that she had shown remarkable strength and courage throughout an experience that would have broken most people completely. Margaret nodded in agreement, adding that she had never been more proud of her daughter than in this very moment, watching her choose self-respect and honesty over the comfortable illusion of a marriage built on hidden truths and unspoken doubts that would have eventually surfaced, regardless of how carefully they had been buried. As they settled into the car, Grace allowed herself to finally release the tears she had been holding back throughout the entire ordeal, her body shaking gently as months of carefully suppressed doubt and hours of overwhelming tension finally found their release. Charlotte held her tightly, allowing her friend the space to grieve fully for the future she had believed in so completely, a future that had crumbled so suddenly and so publicly in front of everyone who mattered most to her. The drive away from the church passed mostly in silence, broken only by Grace's quiet sobs and the occasional gentle words of comfort offered by her mother and closest friend. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of the city pass by, streets she had walked countless times while planning this wedding, streets that now felt strangely foreign given how dramatically her expected future had shifted within the span of a single morning. By the time they arrived back at Margaret's house, Grace felt emotionally and physically exhausted, the weight of everything that had happened finally catching up with her fully. She changed out of her wedding dress slowly, folding it carefully despite everything, unable yet to decide what she would eventually do with a garment that now carried such complicated memories. As she sat quietly in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the comforting presence of her mother and best friend, she began to feel the first small stirrings of clarity about the path forward, understanding that though today had brought unimaginable pain, it had also given her the strength to choose honesty and self-respect over a future built on compromise and hidden truths. In the weeks that followed, Grace slowly began rebuilding her life, piece by piece, moving through each day with a quiet determination that surprised even herself, given the depth of pain she had experienced on what should have been her wedding day. She spent long hours talking with Margaret and Charlotte, processing everything that had happened, gradually finding clarity about what she truly wanted from her future, separate from the plans she had built so carefully around a relationship that had ultimately proven far less honest than she deserved. She returned to her work as a marketing coordinator with renewed focus, throwing herself into projects that had previously taken a backseat to wedding planning, discovering a sense of purpose and accomplishment in her career that reminded her of the strength and capability she possessed, independent of any romantic relationship. Her colleagues, aware of the difficult situation she had faced, offered quiet support without prying too deeply into details she preferred to keep private, allowing her the space to heal at her own pace. Charlotte remained a constant presence throughout this period, checking in regularly, inviting Grace to social gatherings that gently encouraged her back into a world beyond the heartbreak she had experienced. Slowly, Grace began accepting these invitations, finding comfort in reconnecting with friends she had neglected during the busy months of wedding preparation, rediscovering parts of her identity that had somehow become overshadowed by her singular focus on building a future with Daniel. Margaret, watching her daughter navigate this difficult period with remarkable resilience, often reminded her how proud she felt of the strength Grace had shown, both in the moment she chose to walk away from the altar and in the months that followed as she worked to rebuild her sense of self. She told Grace repeatedly that true courage was not avoiding heartbreak entirely, but facing it directly and choosing to move forward with dignity, rather than settling for less than what one truly deserved from a partner and a future together. Daniel, for his part, reached out several times in the weeks following the wedding, attempting to apologize more fully and perhaps hoping for a chance at reconciliation. Grace responded to his messages with calm, measured honesty, expressing that while she held no lasting anger toward him, she needed distance and time to heal fully from everything that had happened, and she gently but firmly asked him to respect her need for space as she continued rebuilding her life independently. Laura, too, reached out once, sending a brief message expressing continued regret for the pain caused by the circumstances surrounding their unexpected meeting, though she also expressed hope that both Grace and Daniel would eventually find genuine peace and happiness moving forward, regardless of the paths their separate lives now took. Grace appreciated the gesture, responding with equally brief but sincere words acknowledging that ultimately, they had both been affected by choices that belonged entirely to Daniel alone. As months passed, Grace found herself drawn increasingly toward activities and pursuits she had long postponed during her relationship with Daniel, enrolling in an evening photography course she had always wanted to try, reconnecting with distant relatives she had lost touch with, and even planning a solo trip to the countryside, something she had never felt confident enough to do independently, before this experience forced her to rediscover her own strength and self-reliance. During a quiet evening several months after the wedding that never fully happened, Grace sat with Charlotte in her newly rented apartment, reflecting on how dramatically her life had shifted since that difficult morning in the church. She admitted that while the pain of that day would likely never fully disappear, she had come to see it as a strange kind of gift, a painful but necessary lesson that had ultimately redirected her toward a life built on authenticity and self-respect rather than compromise and hidden truths. Charlotte squeezed her friend's hand warmly, telling her how much she admired the woman Grace had become through this challenging experience, someone stronger, wiser, and more attuned to her own worth than she had ever been before, walking into that church on what she once believed would be the happiest day of her life. Grace smiled softly at these words, feeling genuine gratitude for the unwavering support of her mother and closest friend throughout every difficult moment of her healing journey. As she looked toward the future with newfound clarity and confidence, Grace understood that true happiness could never be built on foundations of hidden truths and unspoken doubts, regardless of how deeply one loved another person. She walked forward into her new life with quiet strength, carrying with her the powerful lesson that choosing herself, even in the most painful and public moment imaginable, had ultimately been the bravest and most important decision she had ever made, opening the door to a future defined entirely by honesty, self-respect, and the unwavering belief that she deserved nothing less than complete truth from anyone she chose to share her life with going forward.